Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Today is September 25th, 2019, and we're in the midst of a phenomenal confluence of events. The system's blowing up, and we can see it in a number of ways, and we'll be evaluating them in the course of the discussion. I think we should probably start with the efforts by the Democrats, with the announcement by Nancy Pelosi that they're going to begin an impeachment inquiry. Helga, this is a dramatic leap into the unknown for them, isn't it?
Well, I think you have to see all of these elements together. The unbelievable intervention by Greta Thunberg at the UN Special Climate Action Conference, which we should really talk about because this is an unbelievable manipulation by the banks. It has very little to do with this poor little girl. The fact that the financial system is about blowing and that the Democrats clearly are being told by their financial backers that they have to get rid of Trump by all means because they don't want Trump in a position when the system is about to disintegrate. So I think that what is happening right now is an unbelievable historical moment, and it really requires an intervention to change the agenda completely. Now, what the Democrats are trying to do is to go for impeachment on a very flimsy pretext, namely that President Trump talked to the new president of Ukraine, Zelensky, basically asking him to clean out the corruption. And the Democrats basically say this is a complete intervention, by a foreign government. Now, the lawyer of Trump, Giuliani, has already demanded from the present Ukrainian government that they should turn over all the information concerning the intervention previously of the previous government in the 2016 election on behalf of Hillary Clinton. And we know that this is all closely related to the events of 2014. So I think the Democrats are clearly on a suicide mission. They have no case. Pelosi clearly resisted this for a very long time. But they are completely desperate. And the renowned lawyer Dershowitz said, if you go for impeachment, you have to have at least the crime defined, and there is no crime. Now, this is causing complete chaos. Some reasonable Democrats don't go along, like Tulsi Gabbard. She said she will not support this because it's divisive and leads to a terrible crisis in the United States. But you have some Republicans, like William Weld, of all people, who wants to challenge the nomination of Trump in the upcoming election, in the upcoming primaries, who basically said this is treason on behalf of Trump. And according to the Constitution, there is only one penalty, and that is the death penalty. This is unbelievable. Now, he basically says, that Trump should rather accept impeachment rather than face the death penalty. Now, this is beyond the beyond, and people should just understand who William Weld is. He was the US attorney in Boston who was the key instigator in the entire case against my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche. He was the perpetrator of what Ramsey Clark correctly called the biggest injustice in American history. And he is now the same person behind the uh, attempt to oust Trump from office one way or another. I think this all can backfire, and it just brings up the necessity to really go for the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche, because this thing will backfire. This can potentially bring the entire truth out of what has been going wrong in American politics for the last several decades. And I can only tell people, I mean, this is going to bring the truth into what happened, and you should be tuned in it and help us to get this truth out.
I think one of the important things for potentials for backfire is Biden's role with the Obama administration in running the coup in Ukraine in 2014.
I can't hear you. There is no tone.
The Biden role in 2014 to run this neocon, neo-Nazi coup in Ukraine is part of the whole picture, which later evolved into Russiagate, isn't it?
Yes, and you know, Biden was Obama's point man. He worked with Victoria Nuland, and you know, I think this can really completely backfire. I think the Democrats also must know that now the whole story about Biden's son will come up. Giuliani already said that he pocketed 3 million in being on the board of this oil and gas company. And it probably means the Democrats know that Biden's Democratic presidential race is finished.
And also, it intersects the Russiagate in that Christopher Steele was very much involved in the Ukraine operation, working through John Kerry's assistant Weiner in the State Department. So the potential for backfire is great. Now, also, in terms of the backfire, is the whole role of the banks in the pushing of the UN climate change, the Paris Accord, and so on. Let's talk for a minute about the banking crisis. You've been emphasizing the importance of this repo crisis as a return to 2008 and worse. What's going on with this?
Well, you have a situation right now where obviously you have a tremendous liquidity crisis. And the Federal Reserve has been injecting almost more than $300 billion last year. This week they started with 75 billion overnight lending, which did not meet the demand. So we are clearly sitting on a complete powder keg where all the parameters of 2008 are there again. And I think the fact that Thomas Cook, the you know, tourism firm in Great Britain, went belly up immediately overnight, you know, shutting down 21,000 jobs, stranding 650,000 passengers, is just a reflection of this, because you know these are is hitting now firms which have a large debt, and when you know they have been used to roll over this debt, now the banks are not taking the risk anymore. So you can expect many such more bankruptcies like Thomas Cook. Uh, Another one is a large bus company, which is again 1,300 jobs in Great Britain, and a small bank called Metro Bank. And I think we are seeing just the tip of the iceberg. This may very well be the beginning of the disintegration of the financial system. And this is why the banks are so absolutely desperate to impose this green financing fraud, which obviously cannot function, but it's a very serious effort to bamboozle the whole world into accepting a scheme which would have tremendous consequences in terms of reduction of population. And, you know, this is what just was attempted at this UN climate summit in New York.
Well, one of the people who spoke there was the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, who was the person who called in at the Jackson Hole Summit recently for a regime change in financing. Isn't that pretty transparent that you have the bankers now out in front of the so-called green movement?
Well, it was that all along, because the Greta phenomena is relatively recent. Also, Friday for Future and Extinction Rebellion, these are all creations of the last year. But basically, this all comes out of the COP21, the Paris Climate Accord, where Article 2 for the first time said that the only way how you can implement climate protection is by channeling the entire financial investment into green financing, by basically, you know, going out of all coal-fired power plants by 2030, or at least 3/4 of them. And basically what happened immediately afterwards was the Green Finance Initiative was formed in Great Britain, with Mark Carney playing a prominent role. And the intention was clearly stated to make London the financial hub for the future green financing. And what you have seen in the meantime is an attempt to impose legislation. This will happen in the EU. It's already happening with the climate cabinet in Germany. And they are clearly trying to use now this UN special summit to impose this on a global scale. Now, this is completely unworkable. If you direct all financing, and these 130 banks, which Carney basically represented in a so-called compact for green financing, they represent supposedly $47 trillion. And if you do that, well, I mean, first of all, you will collapse the economy. There's no way this can function, because, you know, you may think that you can have a short-term financial profit, but you are destroying the real economy. You are going into low energy flux densities, which only mean a very low population density, which you can carry. So this is really a depopulation policy. And I think we have not seen the last of it, because you cannot reduce the living standard, the life expectancy of millions and 100 millions and maybe billions of people around the globe, because this would be the effect of these policies. So this is a terrible crisis. And I think this UN show, this climate action conference, was a gigantic effort to brainwash the population into accepting it. And poor Greta, who obviously went completely hysterical. I mean, people who watched her short clip saw this young girl is really very close to a breakdown. I think she can't take it. I mean, as you know, many young people are completely desperate. You have now psychological treatments for young people because they have traumatic breakdowns, because they think the world is coming to an end in 18 months. They're all going to die. What is happening here, with the support of the media and unfortunately also some of the renowned political leaders of the world, is so absolutely irresponsible, because they're driving a whole segment of the youth population into despair. And this is based all on a fraud, because, you know, the climate change is not caused primarily by anthropogenic reasons, but it is caused by processes which have to do with the sun, the solar system. And, you know, what is happening right now is a complete fraud, and it's absolutely irresponsible, and it's almost criminal, because, you know, it's an effort to bamboozle the world population into accepting a scheme which is supposed to save the banking system when it is collapsing more big time than 2008. And I think this can only lead to a total catastrophe if we don't intervene and change the agenda dramatically. And I think the immediate answer must be Glass-Steagall and the 4 laws which were designed by my husband.
And we are intervening with this new pamphlet, CO2 Reduction Is a Mass Murder Policy, designed by Wall Street and the City of London. That's a pamphlet that we're getting out, and that our viewers should download, should get copies, should purchase copies from it and circulate it. Now, Helge, you mentioned something about the ultimate goal of this policy of depopulation through deindustrialization, destroying the energy sector. This is what your husband wrote about prior to the decision by Nixon in 1971 to dismantle the Bretton Woods system. And I wonder if you can just give people a picture of what Lynn warned about at that time and how accurate his forecasting was.
Well, my husband had developed his own economic scientific method based on the principles of physical economy, of Leibniz, of Riemann, And from that standpoint, he criticized already in the beginning of the 50s the absolute idiocy of mathematics, of algorithms, of information theory, of von Neumann, Wiener, all of these theories as being completely inadequate to describe processes in the real physical economy. So he, from that point of view, recognized as the only person at the time what was the significance of the Nixon measures where he, on the 15th of August in 1971, decoupled the dollar from the gold standard. He ended the fixed exchange rates and replaced them with a floating exchange rate system. And my husband at that point said that this dismantling of the Bretton Woods system and the implementation of monetarist policies would lead necessarily to a new depression and the danger of a new fascism, unless you would replace it with a new world economic order. Now, I think this was absolutely prophetic. And I think what we are seeing right now is exactly that. The whole financial system of the transatlantic sector is based entirely on algorithms, on mathematics. It has absolutely nothing to do anymore with the real economy. The entire financial sector is completely separated from any relation to the real economy. And this system is now breaking down. And what we see right now is a modern version of what Hjalmar Schacht did and Montague Norman in the 30s in reaction to the financial crisis of the 30s. What they're trying to do right now is to implement fascist policies, which are, would mean brutal austerity, cutting down the living standard, which leads to the, cutting down of the life expectancy in the so-called advanced sector, because it would make health service more expensive and so forth. But it would mean mass genocide in the developing countries, because if you deny these countries access to affordable energy, you just say no development at all. So what we see right now is a gigantic effort to basically repeat fascist economics with modern characteristics. And I think that the only remedy to that is exactly, in a certain sense, what Roosevelt did in 1933, because fascism at that time only was implemented in Europe with Hitler, with Mussolini, with Franco. But Franklin D. Roosevelt went for a New Deal. He went for Glass-Steagall. He implemented the Pecora Commission. I think that's something we urgently should revive right now in respect to these bankers, because all these 130 banks, I mean, they announced at this summit, or they talked about responsible banking. um, I mean, these are banks, which Deutsche Bank, Barclays, all of these banks have a long record of being involved in the Libor scandal, in the, in the various manipulations. I mean, they have a long record of, criminal activity, which we should, basically have a Pecora Commission today. But unlike Roosevelt, they're talking about a Green New Deal, which is the opposite of what Roosevelt did. And what we need is exactly the entire package. Glass-Steagall, separate the banks. If they can't get their books in order, they should declare insolvency. We need to go to a system of national banking, of a new international credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, and we have to have a crash program to increase the productivity of the failing economy through a crash program for fusion and international space cooperation. And we are circulating right now a short petition to this effect, that we have to answer this coincidence of the financial collapse and the attempt to impose green financing, which cannot function with the package, the four laws of Lyndon LaRouche. And I would ask all of you, our viewers, to help us to circulate this and change the agenda, because it's a crisis, but it's not a climate crisis. It's a crisis of the system is coming down.
Well, as your husband described it many, many years ago, it's ecological fascism or eco-fascism. That's the absolutely appropriate term. And our viewers should note that our organizers are going to campuses all over the world, including all over the United States. And they should join us. And you wrote a beautiful leaflet about reason is in the stars that would inspire young people to look to the heavens instead of walking around thinking the Armageddon is right around the corner. Now, Helga, one other thing I'd like you to comment on is the line that's coming out from this climate summit is that almost all leaders in the world support the green agenda, and there are only a handful of climate deniers, and that they're making the argument that young people all over the world want this green agenda. And we know that that's simply not the case. I mean, how can they, why don't you just say something about that? Because I think this is a part of the insanity that's being pushed.
Well, there was just the publication of a letter, actually a letter to General Secretary of the United Nations, Guterres, signed by 500 very prominent scientists from many countries, who basically say there is no climate emergency. It's just not true. And therefore, since there is no connection between CO2 emission and climate change, they appeal to the governments of the world that they should not implement measures which are extremely expensive, which will have dramatic effects on the life and even, the existence of millions of people. And they appeal basically that this should not take place, but that there must be an honest scientific debate about what is going on with the climate, which is a very complex question. So it is not true that there is this consensus, and John Kerry, basically just announced that he will go against the axis, and he uses this word axis, of climate deniers and skeptics. I mean, this has gone completely haywire, and I think we have to go back to reason and go back to the discussion of what are the laws of the physical universe, why we need, for example, international space cooperation to find out more about what the climate causes or climate change causes actually are. And I think that there is good hope because, apart from many things which we don't have time now to comment on, but one of the better things Trump did in the recent period, he, at the occasion of the visit of the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, did talk about international space cooperation, that the United States wants cooperation to go to the moon as the launching pad to go to Mars. And when Prime Minister Modi attended this big meeting in Houston, which Trump also attended, they were talking about international space cooperation among the two countries. And the reason why we counter this green insanity with the space orientation is because once people start to look at the real universe and start to look at science, because in space you can only exist if you follow the physical laws of the universe and not some ideology, then you get out of this complete ideological brainwashing which is happening right now. So I would invite people to join our campaign and have a real scientific discussion about all of these questions and not go for this hysterical outbursts.
I think there's one other counterpoint that you're especially authoritative as a commentator on it, which is the difference between the apocalyptic outlook of the world is running out of resources and we can't have endless growth. That's one of the things Greta attacked. You were just in China at a conference. The Chinese don't buy this. They're continuing to pursue legitimate goals, whether it's in space, that are related to the physical economy. Give us a little bit of a sense of what happened at this conference in Xi'an that you attended.
Oh, this was a very interesting conference, the Euro-Asia Economic Forum, which is taking place every 2 years since 2003. And, we were talking about, I was talking about the need for the West to better understand the motives of the Chinese, because, there is right now this absolutely anti-Chinese hysteria. You have the Hong Kong color revolution attempt to destabilize China. And the Chinese really don't understand why all of this is happening, because, as I said in my presentation, from the Chinese standpoint, the last 40 years of reform and opening up has just transformed life for the majority of the Chinese from being a very poor, underdeveloped country into now the second largest economy in the world. And in some categories, I think they're already taking the first place. And they must be doing something right. And I think rather than being so hysterical and trying to contain the rise of China and of Asia for that matter, which I don't think is possible unless you go to World War III, people should rather ask themselves, what are the principles of the Chinese economic miracle? What are the Chinese doing right, and what is the West doing not right anymore? And there is one very interesting example which I think illustrates the case, and that is the fact that China just announced that they have finished their second international airport in Beijing. They only started the planning 4 years ago. They completed it in less than 4 years for $11 billion cost. This will transport soon 100 million passengers per year. And, this will be probably the most modern, largest airport in the world. And if you compare that to the pitiful misery of the so-called BER, the never being built airport in Berlin, which is becoming the laughingstock of the whole world, people should ask themselves, what is Germany doing wrong and what is China doing right, that they are able to do what the Germans perfectly were capable to do a couple of decades ago. And since we can't discuss this now in depth, I want to say it as food for thought. And, I think we need more rationality in the discussion and less ideology. And that is what the Schiller Institute is for. So get this special report about what's behind the green financing assault on the economy. Join us in the campaign for Glass-Steagall and the implementation of 4 laws, and otherwise be reasonable and don't fall for hysteria.
And be happy. Don't be influenced by the sad sack appearance of the young lady from Sweden. Helga, I think that's all we have time for, so I'd like to thank you and see you next week.
Yes, till next week.